All right, so yeah, we are going to get started right away because we are a little bit tight for time, and so we've got 58 participants it looks like so far, and those who join later can join later. But I will start by welcoming everyone to the Future of Forests webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks to our panelists for joining us today. I'm going to be your host. My name is Katie Krelove, and I'm the Ontario campaigner with the Wilderness Committee. And I want to start by acknowledging that the forests that we're speaking about today are all on the traditional and treaty territories of the 133 First Nation communities in the land we now call Ontario. As a settler, I acknowledge that there is much work to be done in pursuit of land-based reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, including in prioritizing Indigenous sovereignty and traditional knowledge in forest management planning. So we have a great and large lineup of presenters today. As you can see, we've got, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to change my slide. Hold on. Oh, yeah. So as you can see, we've got a large bunch of panelists today. And this webinar is, to me, I'm kind of thinking of it as a sort of speed dating introduction to some of the current conservation and consultation concerns with the state of industrial logging regulations and forest management in Ontario today. So this is by no means a comprehensive education, but we hope to connect you today with the issues, some of the issues, and some of the organizations that are working on them, and inspire you with ways to stay involved. So we also hope to hold future webinars that delve more deeply into some of the issues that you'll hear about today. So we're going to have 5-minute presentations from each of our panelists, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So please, we're going to take your questions in the Q&A section. So if you have a question at any time, put it in the Q&A section. If it's directed to a particular person or a particular presentation, it's helpful if you can say that. And that should be accessed at either the top or the bottom of your screen. And we'll get to as many questions as we can. We will also be following up with all of you with an email with the recording of this webinar, so it will be recorded as well. And we'll also share with you some of the links to action tools and info that are mentioned in the different presenters' presentations. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Anna Baggio, who is the Conservation Director for the Wildlands League. All right, so Anna, I'm gonna stop share and you can share your screen.
Can you just enable participant sharing?
Oh yes, sorry, hold on.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving us the time to be part of a kind of a very unique panel. It's great to have so many different perspectives, so I'm glad to be here. And I also appreciate the variety of expertise, and hopefully we can do more of these in the future.
All right, Anna, you should be able to share now.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the environmental guardrails that have been removed in order to enable a doubling of logging in Ontario. I work for the Wildlands League, and I'm so glad so many of you could join. Some of the key messages I want to deliver today are there has been a tilting of the board in favor of industrial forestry in Ontario. The Ford government has recklessly pursued red tape reduction and deregulation to facilitate a doubling of logging. And it's up to all of us to scrutinize irresponsible logging plans and to find ways to protect habitat. We're all just going to have to work that much harder. And instead of plowing into the remaining primary and intact forests for more 2x4s and toilet paper and leaving logging scars behind, how can we make room for one of the country's most iconic wildlife species, caribou? And solutions are possible. So I'll just begin with a quick overview of some of the changes that we've seen in Ontario. Let me find them. Sharing that.
So Anna, it looks like you've gone out of share screen.
Oh, sorry. I'll just be 1 second. Did I not share that? All right. Did you hear that, or did you only hear me? You didn't see me? How's that?
There's been a lot of upheaval in the last couple of years with respect to environmental protections and what's happening in our public forests. So if I take a look at where we are today in terms of a snapshot, in terms of environmental oversights, protections, or public participation, what we have is, in terms of forestry, just this past summer, it was permanently exempted from environmental assessment. So we had that. And then just recently with Bill 229, forestry was permanently exempted from having to protect and recover species at risk. And there are over 50 species at risk in Ontario that overlap with commercial forestry operations. And these commercial forestry operations cover half the province. So the stakes are enormously high, and we will be poorer because we will not have forestry being required to protect and recover species. So there's that. And then when we look at the Environmental Bill of Rights, these are rights that the public, that you have to participate in decision making and to hold the government to account. And the government seems to be willing to circumvent these rights, sometimes even legislate these requirements out after the fact, or use omnibus budget bills to ram through legislative changes that have nothing to do with budget bills, but escape public scrutiny. And so from an environmental bill standpoint, it's really questionable. And what does that leave us with in terms of oversight of our public forests in Ontario? All we're left with now is the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. And this is from 1994, and it needs to be reformed. This act is incredibly out of date. And when you layer in that the province wants to double logging, has a deregulation agenda, is leaving the public out of decisions, and that the Crown Forest Sustainability Act disrespects Indigenous rights, and that we seem to be in the middle of a redrawing of the board where everything is tilted in favor of industry, what we're going to be left with is a rather unsettled position where we're going to get more wasteful logging practices that's not going to help us in the climate crisis. It's going to make our extinction crisis worse, and it's going to leave us in a more precarious position. And the public is going to be left out in the cold, and frankly, we're going to see more controversy and more conflict.
So thank you for your patience with that. It's always tricky trying to navigate COVID with these in these times. So hopefully you saw that, and then if not, I can make the link available on afterwards to where you can get that video. What I will say is, as a quick summary, what Ontario got rid of, and just three things to bring to mind. Number one is what we call the bump up tool, or increased scrutiny, so of forest management plans. And this is an appeal mechanism that the public had to go to the Ministry of Environment when they couldn't get their issues resolved with the forest company and the MNR. They had this ability to appeal to the MOE. It's called the bump up tool, and that tool is no longer available for residents. It was not taken away, that tool was not removed for Indigenous concerns, but it was taken away for non-Indigenous people. The other requirement that I mentioned is that the requirement for forestry to protect and recover endangered and threatened species as per the Endangered Species Act, that was removed. So that's a permanent exemption for forestry. And then this one is, and then the final one, which is particularly egregious to me, is that just recently the province said that the Minister of Environment would not be able to use a species protection order or a habitat protection order in response to concerns from forestry. So you start to see that these things are all piling up in terms of tilting the board more in favor of industrial logging and industrial forest companies in Ontario. And what this means for boreal caribou is that it's all going to be increasing the risks to an already threatened species. And for some of you that haven't had a chance to be directly involved in boreal caribou, it is a threatened species provincially and nationally. It's also an indicator of a healthy boreal forest, requires large tracts of undisturbed and continuous habitat. And this is what puts them on a collision course with the resource sector. So in terms of forestry, road building, mining. And part of why they're in such a hard place is that they have low reproductive potential and they're young or sensitive to predation. So it's a really hard problem to try and disentangle forestry and caribou because they both have needs. And right now, the needs of caribou are not being met. And finally, what I'll just say maybe I won't, I'll just stop there and say that I have some examples from across Ontario that I can talk about a bit of where we have these conflicts with forestry and what can be done. Solutions are possible, but right now we're seeing, we're very disheartened, and the tilting of the board to forestry is having real world consequences to non-forestry users. And we can talk a little bit about that later. So thank you very much. And
Okay, great. Thanks, Anna. And yeah, we're going to save questions till the end, but if you have questions for Anna specifically, you can put them in the Q&A box right now, so you don't forget them. But we are going to move on to our next presenter is Dave Pierce, also from the Wildlands League. He is the Forest Conservation Manager. So Dave, if you want to share your screen.
Can you guys see that? Hopefully you can see that.
We can, Dave.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Katie. And thanks, Anna, for setting that up. I'm going to go, Anna's very current in her presentation. I'm going to go back in time a little bit. I'm going to talk about logging scars, but then I'm also going to talk a little bit about Algonquin Park. So hopefully I'll go through quick enough, but be thorough at the same time. So Canada actually has a deforestation problem, but most of Canada doesn't know it yet. We at the Wildlands League, and specifically Trevor Hesselink, our colleague, has exposed a really ignored footprint of industrial logging on our public lands. And these are areas that cumulatively are quite vast. And they're, we call them logging scars, and they're persisting for decades, at least 30 years after logging happens. And these impacts, as Anna mentioned, caribou are under threat. They threaten caribou. And they really counteract our efforts as in Canada to mitigate climate change. So we found in our research, there's over 22,000 hectares are deforested each year, extrapolating from our findings in Ontario. And what that means is in the past 30 years, an estimated 650,000 hectares of forest have actually been deforested in Ontario. And that's big. That's bigger than most of our provincial parks. And it means that by 2030, when Canada is supposed to be meeting its climate change targets for under the Paris Agreement, the amount of lost carbon sequestration could be equivalent to more than a year of emissions from all the passenger vehicles in Canada. So we found this quite incredible because governments have been, and industry have been saying for years that Canada has zero deforestation. But that's not what we were seeing in the bush when we'd fly over or drive around. There were these patches that Trevor called logging scars. And this really got under Trevor's skin so much that he went out kind of rogue on his summer vacation, and he bought a drone, and he did a lot of pre-research using remote sensing and GIS and aerial photography. And then he went out and he field tested or field verified 27 of these sites. And he drove and mountain biked all around northwestern Ontario. And so his work reveals that in at least the first 3 decades after logging, roads and landings typically remain barren of trees. On average, about 14% of each clear cut is in this condition. And the problem's been ignored by officials because there's been this optimistic belief that these areas will grow back. And also it's been limited by data because they were looking at kind of using very coarse visualizations when they look remotely at these areas. So amazingly, that this hasn't been scrutinized by anybody until now. And the main culprit is what's called full tree harvesting, which is pretty wasteful, actually. And this involves it's a harvest method under the clear-cut silvicultural system, where they go out and with a grapple skidder, we'll bring entire trees to the roadside. Not the roots in the stump, but from the stump up, and they're dragged to the roadside. And then with big tracked machinery called delimbers, they take off the tops and the branches and the bark, and the unmerchantable parts of the stump will be cut off, and also unmerchantable species will just be left. They're supposed to be burned. Sometimes they are burned, sometimes they're not. But what Trevor found was often it's just left. And so this waste accumulates and basically smothers any opportunity for regrowth. And the compaction of a heavy machinery running up and down these areas also takes a toll on regeneration. So like I said, Trevor actually sampled remotely over 300 sites in northwestern Ontario. And then he ground truthed 27 of those sites, so almost 10%. And they're located within the three caribou ranges, the Churchill, the Bright Sand, and the Nipigon. And the logging scars, even though it's 14% of the clear cut, the impacts for caribou is a lot bigger because caribou will avoid these impacts on the landscapes generally between 1 kilometer and up to 13 kilometers away. So you can see that the impact of the roads and network actually impact a much bigger area. And the caribou are basically being squeezed out. And full tree harvesting, it's used in many other places besides Ontario. So what we've found may be just the tip of the iceberg of deforestation happening in Canada. You can find more if you go to our site loggingscars.ca and see for yourself. You can go click on Explore to see the extent of deforestation. And if you have even Google Earth Pro, you can go into clear cuts in your own neighborhood and throw a polygon around the areas impacted by roads and landings, and you can get your own estimate of how much, based on our research, is really not going to come back. So given this, we are really thinking Wildlands League is saying that business as usual forestry shouldn't be permitted to go into intact forest, given this legacy. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, hopefully have a bit more time, to talk about Algonquin Park. Now, Algonquin has its own deforestation problem, but it's a bit more subtle because full tree harvesting is not used to any large extent. So Algonquin, one public opinion poll ranked Algonquin only second to Banff in terms of national recognition. But most people don't realize that behind the green areas in Algonquin, we think of it all being green, but those white areas are open to logging and road building and aggregate pits, even in brook trout areas of concern. And Algonquin Park has the highest density of natural brook trout lakes in the world. And so this millennial legacy of the millennia is really threatened. So as I said, in the white areas, there are a lot of logging roads. And they're effectively permanent. we have information that there's over 5,500 kilometers of logging roads. That's more than roads that are in the city of Toronto, and it's longer than the distance of the Trans-Canada Highway, almost as long, sorry, between of the Trans-Canada Highway between Halifax and Vancouver. So it's a tremendous amount of roads. It's a permanent deforestation because they're reused every 20 to 30 years in the selection silvicultural system, where they go in and harvest a bit of each stand every few years. So they're essentially permanent roads, and that's over 1 million tons of carbon, and 5,000 hectares permanently deforested in Ontario. And they impinge on the areas. If you can see, the green areas are supposed to be protected within Algonquin. The 35% of Algonquin that's actually protected is not even protected from these roads because they go right through these protected areas. So that's a big problem. And roads really are, in many ways, the worst problem in Algonquin because they facilitate invasive species, they cause erosion, as we said, permanent loss of carbon, and they're threats to, there's lots of roadkill of things like wood turtles, which are threatened. So what we're calling for is an end to Algonquin logging in the park and reforesting the roads. And again, if you want to go to our website, you can see more. And if you want to take action and send a letter to Premier Ford and Minister Yakubuski. Thanks very much. I think my time's up.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Dave. Next up, we have Robin Koistinen from Temagami First Nation. She is the Land and Resources Director there. So Robin, if you want to share your screen and let me know if you have any difficulties.
Share screen. Can you see my screen? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Good day. I'm here to talk to you about what's happening in and around Indaki-Manan. Indaki-Manan is the homeland of my people, the Temiagma Anishinaabe. And we have been involved in forestry since they began to impose assumed jurisdiction in our territory, that being Ontario and Canada, starting with the Temagami Forest Reserve back in 1906, I believe it was. So currently there's 4 units imposed on our territory: Temiskaming, Temagami, Sudbury, and Nipissing. And we've been we review all the plans. We've got issues with more than one plan at one time, but you got to pick your battles sometimes. So currently the Temiagma Anishinaabe and Temagami First Nation are involved in 2 judicial reviews. I was surprised to hear that in Anna's presentation today that the individual environmental requests were not removed from Aboriginal people, because that's not the information that we're working with, but I will look into that a little bit further. So thank you for that. So currently we have 2 judicial reviews underway. One is the Bill 197, which includes the revocation of the declaration order. And that was one of the bills that Anna spoke about, which was an omnibus bill. And there was lots of details in there. And it was supposed to be the COVID budget bill, but it wasn't. There's a lot of stuff jammed into it, and including term and condition 56 as it relates to forest management. So, the declaration order being exempt, there's probably a lot of issues for a lot of people. For us, term and condition 56 represents the sort of like the Indigenous condition within that declaration order that was revoked. And as well, we have commenced a judicial review on the Temiskaming Forest as of February 25th. So Bill 197, from our perspective, this the matter that is before the courts. And we've partnered with other First Nations, including one PTO, which is the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, as well as Attawapiskat, Cree, Chapleau Cree, Eagle Lake, Port Albany, Magnanawan, Mohawks Bay of Quinte, and ourselves. And Okite is acting as our legal counsel, specifically Kate Kempton. So what we were concerned about were the legislative amendments that removes the triggers to consult and accommodate. So with respect to the environmental assessments, and that they were unconstitutional and that they are in violation of Section 35 of the Constitution and the purpose of reconciliation in the honor of the Crown with First Nations. So the other thing that we were very concerned about is bypassing the consultation process, as Anna spoke about earlier, in terms of the Environmental Bill of Rights. It deprived us of the rights to be consulted and accommodated on matters that affect us. So we're currently seeking that, and in fact, this morning I had to do an updated affidavit. This will be my third affidavit filing, because every time we file an affidavit, of course, the Ministry of Natural Resources responds, and then we have to file another affidavit. And so it's kind of an ongoing process, and it's supposed to be heard in May, this particular case. And these things are expensive. I can tell you, our First Nation is, footing the bill along with these other First Nations, and challenging the government's decisions are expensive. So we're under this Bill 197, we're seeking that in order that it is of no force and effect, including its order in council and the regulations, and a declaration of unconstitutionality. The other bill that the other plan that we're doing a judicial review on is actually the Temiskaming Forest Management Plan itself. And we couldn't seek any remedies with the district manager or the regional director insofar as the issue resolution process goes. And in fact, the regional director didn't even hear us, if you could believe it. But anyways, and I'm involved with other First Nations, but the other First Nations aren't involved with the judicial review. So issues on this unit that were not resolved satisfactorily were resource revenue sharing and resource benefit sharing, including treaty and Aboriginal rights. So that's part of reconciliation. The honor of the Crown, when there's a duty, when the Crown is going out to do anything that may affect our rights, they have a responsibility, in fact, a duty to consult and accommodate us. And those rights, those accommodations, they have to be done through mutually acceptable negotiations. And we're just finding that the Crown, insofar as forestry, there is no negotiations process. And so that duty, when they need to consult with us, is when they have knowledge, real or constructive, that the potential of existence of Aboriginal rights or title, and contemplates activities that might adversely affect our rights. And there's, all kinds of case law about that. And consultation must be meaningful and not perfunctory. And we're finding it very perfunctory. And there's the differences too. So there's the local level on the issuance of plans and permits when the Crown has knowledge that it could impact us, as well as the strategic level. So when the Crown is contemplating strategic high-level decisions, so such as Bill 197. With respect to the Temiskaming Forest, they were, bent on delivering a forest management plan, despite COVID and despite the fact that there was no means to gather or consult with meaningfully through this. And one of the things with respect to, we're not compensated for reviewing these plans. So they're to the benefit of third parties, no benefit to ourselves. And so in order to be meaningfully consulted, we need to have resources to be able to do that as well. And at this present time, there's still no such thing as them resourcing us in terms of doing due diligence and reviewing their plans. So with respect to condition 56, which was revoked, we were looking to have those as objectives too within the forest management plan, because we could see that even with term and condition 56 prior to it being revoked, and you got to remember that on the Temiskaming Forest Management Plan, we started off with term and condition 56 in place, but then it got revoked during the development of the plan. And when they were looking at their long-term management direction objectives, they were including, you know, we're going to maximize the benefits to the Temiskaming Forest Alliance industry. That was seen as a perfectly sound objective for them to put into the Temiskaming Forest Management Plan. But yet on the flip side, they didn't want to implement or put into the Forest Management Plan objectives that they could measure to say, you know, how are we as First Nations people benefiting through the forest management plan? Like how many jobs are being created? What's the volume of wood? How many third-party license agreements? Like these all could have been put in there as objectives, as well as the indicators would have been, you know, the number of jobs, the number of volume, like, you know, how many cubic meters, the number of facilitated third-party arrangements, number of forest licenses, number of programs developed to provide jobs, and number of forest resources addressed that are affected by forest management. But because these negotiations never occurred on the Temiskaming unit, we were, you know, and with term and condition 56 being revoked, there is still an option. And so you know, through section 20 of the forest, of the sustainable forest license, it says the same thing. You know, the company and the minister shall work with Aboriginal communities to identify and implement ways of achieving more equal participation by Aboriginal communities and the benefits provided through forest management plan. So I'm talking a little bit at a high level in terms of, you know, Indigenous rights, section 35 of the Constitution, the bills being revoked, but we still too have issues with the way in which they conduct forest management planning activities or implementing forest management plans. And, you know, that's with respect to herbicides. So on one hand, they'll go out and they'll clear cut, you know, and the clear cuts on the Temiskaming unit are massive. They're greater than the size of Bear Island. I don't know if any of you have canoed by Bear Island on Lake Temagami, but Bear Island is 1 square mile. So it's about akin to being 300 hectares. They have, and that's our reserve, and they have clear cuts that are greater than 300 hectares on the Temiskaming forest, greater than 400 hectares. And so what happens though is that it's that intense forest management. So they'll go cut an area that size, then they'll apply the glyphosate and knock all back the competing vegetation. And that's how they site prep. And then they'll go out and plant. And then about, you know, 4 to 5 years later, when the competition of the herbaceous plants is coming back, they'll go back and reset it again with the herbicide application and knock back those herbaceous plants again, which are medicines and things like that, or blueberries. And so it's it's the intensity by which they manage. The other thing we were looking for were healthy birch stands, because as you get further north, you're getting out of the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence, and birch is very special to First Nations, as you're aware, through the medicines that it provides, as well as the sap, as well as the quality of birch in terms for, you know, whether it's canoe building or crafts or those sites things. I've already talked about clear cuts and that they do, you know, the other thing is that their notion is that it clear cuts mimic forest fires. Well, they certainly do not when you're applying the herbicides in which they do. The other things that we were concerned about is habitat. As you know, I heard an earlier person speak about, and particularly around shorelines and riparian reserves. You know, that there's a lot of habitat within that area from when the lake and it transitions to the forest, as well as, you know, they've got this notion of these moose emphasis areas now. Well, you know, on a landscape basis, well, I'm not so sure that the moose know where to go to their moose emphasis areas that they're leaving behind. But in the meantime, we certainly would like to see the moose aquatic feeding areas protected, their bedding areas, and their breeding areas. And I really don't think they have a good handle on moose habitat and the impacts that forestry have on moose, which is, you know, a big deal for us in terms of our household economies and our sustenance. So the other area that, you know, with this clear cutting, some tract grounds are essentially removed of any forested areas, and they keep going back to the same areas, especially if that's where they just built that road or so on. So we're concerned about that as well. The other thing, they're not really that willing to incorporate our knowledge, like our years of observation. We've been here for thousands of years observing this land and living on this land. To us, it's not a wilderness. So sometimes I take issue even with some other NGOs out there. This is our homeland. It's not a wilderness from where we come from. You know, as well, UNDRIP. So, you know, that's the United Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And we believe we have the right to say no, and that, you know, everything should be, we should have the ability to have prior and informed consent on anything that's, you know, with respect to our rights and interests, and that we have been put here by the Creator to protect and occupy our lands and govern our lands. And the assumed jurisdiction that M&R has put onto our territory, we never gave them any authority to govern our lands. So that's, you know, that's another area where we are very concerned about their assumed jurisdiction. And that's it. So thank you, Miigwech, and I hope I didn't overstep my time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Robin. If you want to just stop sharing your screen, and we'll go over to PJ Justison, who is the president of the Friends of Temagami group. And PJ, I'm going to hold you to your 5 minutes.
Very good. Thank you, and welcome everybody. Thank you, Robin, for the presentation. That was very informative. I'm going to speak to the grassroots level of consultation in the forestry management planning process. And I'm going to give you a little bit of my background and a little bit of the group's background in order to do that. So the Friends of Temagami is an all-volunteer organization. It's small, but we're mighty. We've been around for 26 years now. And we have been involved in forestry management planning for a number of years. Although with the cycle being 10 years long, you know, the people that were experienced in the forestry management have moved on. So it's left with some new folks, one of those folks being me. A little bit about me. I am relatively new to the Temagami area in terms of others. I went on a canoe trip probably 14 years ago and happened by a very special place and some special people. And here I am 13 years later. I'm an emerge nurse by trade. I have got no background in forestry. I've got no, I hesitate to say that I'm really not an environmentalist or was, you know, always an environmentalist. I would say that I've become a conservationalist out of the sheer need to do so. So the FOT, the Friends of Temagami, has been involved in all 4 of the forestry management planning processes in Nipissing, Temagami, Sudbury, and Temiskaming. Although by the time we got to the Temiskaming FMP, which is just finishing up now, we were pretty tired and found the process completely broken. So we didn't really bother too much. I will speak specifically to our involvement in the Temagami FMP. As you can well imagine, these FMPs are long and complex. They take a number of years. The actual final plan is almost 300 pages. The supplementary documentation to that plan is 1,400 and some odd pages. The Friends of Temagami, did hundreds of hours of work on that FMP to consult and, be involved with the planning process. Not satisfied at all. There are a number of different things that we can speak to. To name a few, it's not public consultation whatsoever. Even their public meetings are a drop-in process where you don't actually get a formalized chance to interact with people. All our comments we found out a good part of the way along were kept completely private. They weren't shared with the public. They weren't even shared with the local citizens committee. They weren't shared with the First Nations. So we went out of our way at that point to be sure that we put a disclaimer on all our comments that they were to be shared publicly and with anybody that was interested. And we specifically included the First Nations in order to not depend upon the MNRF to share those comments. I would contend that consultation process, I was going to say it's broken, but it was never right in the first place. They've gone out of their way to divide people and to keep concerns separate from anybody that has shared interests or shared concerns. The MNRF is quite guilty of subversion and the division of parties. I'll mention the Temagami Management Unit specifically. We went through all 5 stages of it. We went through a number of resolution meetings, including the district manager and regional director, without any satisfaction. We did go to an environmental assessment request, i.e. a bump up request. It was, quickly and curtly denied, but in that process, they went out of their way to be sure that, it included TFN's land set aside in their planning process and their plans and future potential on that section of land. We weren't even aware that process was going on, and it was damaging. It was very damaging, and it's this type of behavior on the MNRF's part that is disturbing. I honestly, I can't explain how disturbed I am by that ministry. Anyway, I will say that, I'm proud of the work that our organization has done. It is on record that we've, tried to consult. It is found in the depths of that supplementary documentation file at 1,400 and some odd pages long. I will also mention that, you know, FOT is not against forestry or, you know, doesn't claim that all forestry should stop in the Temagami region. I think, you know, we think that there's room for everybody to get along and work together in that process, but not in the current manner that we're doing business. That is for sure. We have a couple of main concerns, you know, with the forestry, and I don't think that they're so far-fetched. The biggest one would be do an appropriate consultation with First Nations, which of course we've really don't have any way of knowing that one way or another, nor maybe is it our business. But that should be, you know, it should be a concern for all of us. The next one would be glyphosate use. You know, if anybody thinks that that's a good idea, other than the MNRF and the industry, we don't need to go into the details of it. It's not a good idea. It should be stopped. The incursion of intact forest landscapes, our Save Soulless campaign is a perfect example. It's one of the last remaining intact forests in near North Ontario, and they want to drive a road right through it for no particularly good reason. You know, and the access that these roads provide is the most damaging thing. As Dave mentioned, it has a long-lasting effect. And the clear cuts, the large clear cuts are obviously a concern. It'll be 32 years ago that the Red Squirrel Road blockade took place, and nothing's changed since then. If anything's changed, they've gotten better at, you know, under the guise of public consultation, that they're doing forestry better. They're not doing anything different, and they're not, you know, they might be receiving consultation, but it's not going anywhere. The conflict, you know, in the Temagami region in the forest continues, despite recent local, you know, media suggesting that all's well and everybody's getting along and things are Jim dandy up there. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I've made it clear to the MNRF and to the industry that they have taken, and they have not put one effort into protection or conservation of any area in the Temagami region, at least in recent history.
Sorry, I'm gonna cut you off there.
Let me finish.
I mean, partly because I think that's a good place to stop, and also just because we're running out of time.
Let me finish quickly, Katie. I'm quick. Okay. I've made it clear that we've had enough, and they need to start listening to the public and to First Nations. And if not, they're only going to end up with more conflict. And so, you know, this conflict is brewing and it's about to boil over. So there it is. It's not a good process. Anyway, thank you for your time and attention. Be safe and take good care, everybody.
All right, thanks, PJ. And I am going to pass it on to Courtney Lewis, who is the Manager of Ecosystems Policy for the Canada Project for Natural Resource Defence Council. And I just want to let all of our attendees know that we are prepared to go a little bit beyond our end time of 1 p.m. because we are running behind. So if folks are able to stay, that's great. And again, there will be a recording of this that will be passed around. Okay, so I'll pass it over to you, Courtney.
Thank you, Katie. Could one of the panelists or all the panelists give me a thumbs up if you can hear me and see the presentation? Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name's Courtney Lewis, and I'm an advocate with the Natural Resources Defence Council, which is an international environmental organization. And I'm going to talk about the importance of engaging companies that source wood and pulp products from Canada's boreal forest. There are so many reasons that the boreal forest is significant for communities and species, and it's even important for the global community. One of its international values is the role it plays in combating climate change. Canada's boreal forest holds almost 2 times the amount of carbon as all the world's recoverable oil reserves. But industrial activities can disturb this carbon and release it into the atmosphere. And depending on the end use of those products, some of the final products that those end in can be particularly wasteful and particularly bad for the climate, especially if we're just talking about single-use throwaway products. So this is an image of some protesters. They're actually outside the headquarters of Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati. And in our advocacy, along with our partners, we focused on the role of large, powerful companies that drive much of the sourcing from the forest and are making large profits from using materials that they've acquired through wide-scale industrial logging. Many of these companies have significant resources that they could use to improve the sustainability of their operations and their sourcing practices if they chose to do so. So this is the cover of a report that we put out. It's called the Issue with Tissue Report, and it highlights the way tissue is one of the end uses of boreal wood and pulp. So one company we focused on is Procter & Gamble, which is the largest purchaser of Canada's boreal pulp in the US. And Procter & Gamble's flagship brand, Charmin, which you are probably familiar with, relies on 100% virgin forest pulp, which is a sad use of some of the world's last intact forests, especially when you consider that toilet paper is used just once and then discarded. As solutions, we've urged companies to reduce their reliance on forest pulp, which, as I said, many use to make single-use throwaway products like tissue and toilet paper. So one fact that I think is really informative is that forest-sourced toilet paper, so from virgin forests, emits 3 times more carbon emissions than using recycled paper. And of course, by recycled paper, I mean when one use paper, for example, from that have come from other paper products like newspaper, and then that's repurposed into tissue and toilet paper. And where companies do source wood and pulp, we have stressed the importance of ensuring that it's done in the most sustainable way possible and in ways that respect the rights of communities that are impacted. So absolutely critical is we have stressed the importance of ensuring free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples, which Robin talked about so beautifully, and from sourcing from FSC certified forests. FSC is a forest stewardship certification body, which only approves forest operations that meet a certain level of standards around social and environmental safeguards. FSC has much higher protections than competing forest certifications, particularly SFI, which is a forest certification that has concerned Indigenous and environmental experts over the fact that it allows unsustainable logging practices. We've also been working with partners to educate investors, and we've raised the concerns around the lack of social and environmental protections so widely that last year, 2/3 of Procter & Gamble's shareholders voted for the company to be more transparent about its deforestation and degradation impacts. So people are starting to realize that there is this problem and are starting to pay attention. This sort of corporate engagement has also helped create momentum for government sourcing policies. So just a few weeks ago, for example, California introduced a bill which would require state contracts to have policies that would prevent forest loss, both in the boreal as well as in the tropics. So this is just a link to our website, for example, in which you can send a message to the head of Procter & Gamble. And this is to reiterate that corporate advocacy is a really key strategy to complement direct government engagement, because large, wealthy companies often have enormous influence and resources, and they can even advocate for stronger government policies by showing that they're willing to improve the sustainability of their own practices. So as the public, we can hold companies accountable and say we want them to use their power for good. And one thing that I meant to mention when I talked about our issue with tissue report is there are brands that are doing better and are relying, for example, on recycled content for their tissue and toilet paper. And you can read about that in our issue with tissue scorecard, which is on the NRDC website. But also, again, broadly, beyond consumer decisions, it's really, really important that these really large, powerful, wealthy companies are held accountable and improve the sustainability of their sourcing. And we can talk more about that during the discussion. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Courtney. And next I'm gonna pass it over to Julie Bone, who is the Boreal Programs Manager for Ontario Nature. So Courtney, if you just want to stop sharing your screen. And I'll just point out to the presenters who are still here, if any of you want to go into the Q&A and check out some of the questions that have been asked, if there's any in particular that you feel you can answer, you can send a direct message to that person right in the Q&A as well. Okay, over to you, Julie.
Thanks, Katie. Can you see my presentation? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, all good.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Katie. Thank Katie for organizing today and the other panelists for being here, as well as all the participants. Thanks a lot. So my name is Julie Bone. I'm the Boreal Program Manager for Ontario Nature. I'm based in Thunder Bay, where I run our program here. And so did Robin on some of the deregulation that's happening. I'll just say, as a person who's worked on forestry and wildlife issues for 20 years, it's pretty disheartening. And in particular, because a lot of those rules and regulations were hard won by grassroots activists. And we're already seeing some of the consequences of those changes, including, as Anna mentioned, through the bump up requests that we're no longer able to submit bump up requests. But with all that happening, I think it's important now more than ever that we make sure we're using the entire toolbox that we have in terms of conservation. And as Courtney had mentioned, and I see there's some questions in the Q&A, I'm going to speak just really briefly about some assessments that I've done on the FSC system, on the Forest Stewardship Council system, and some opportunities that we think are there. Did my slide not move forward? Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm going to talk about protected areas and Canada protected areas specifically. So here's what we know. We are facing this dual climate change and biodiversity loss crisis. And not only do we need to address it to protect ourselves, as we're already having impacts from these things, but also that I think most of us agree we have a moral imperative to protect the non-human beings that we coexist with, as well as make sure we're providing properly for future generations. And the biodiversity loss crisis in particular has been part of the global consciousness through the Convention on Biological Diversity and some of the targets around that. And through that, Canada promised to protect 17% of lands and inland waters by 2020. And here we are in 2021, and we've blown past that target without achieving it. And in Ontario, we're not really even close to achieving it. So I'm just including a map here to show some of the different targets that are out there right now and where we are in Ontario. The FSC system requires a minimum of 10% protection on forest management units. We had the 17% commitment through the IHG targets, which we now have some new targets to have 25% protected by 2025. And then I just threw in the 50% protection there because some scientists are suggesting that we're actually going to need to seriously look at setting aside half the planet from industrial development if we're going to succeed in doing this. And that's a pretty lofty goal, but it is out there. Okay, so many of us many panelists, as well as I'm sure some of the participants, are part of this FSC system, whether that's through supporting the standard development or participating in annual audits. or like the work that Courtney's doing on marketplace incentives. And just a really quick recap of what FSC is: it's voluntary, and in return for companies meeting the standard, they get preference in the marketplace. And I know people have commented, you see on your envelopes with your bills each month, FSC logos, you see it on 2x4s, you see it on lots of harvested wood products. The requirements of FSC exist with many elements around Indigenous rights, around workers' rights and safety, around species at risk, as well as landscape conservation. And as someone had questioned and mentioned in the Q&A, the system is only as good as it's implemented. So I'm going to look a little bit at how this one aspect has been implemented. So in June 2019, FSC launched its new standard, and that was after 6 years of meetings, dozens and dozens of meetings and negotiations and knowledge sharing forums between the 4 chambers of the FSC system, which include environmental, Indigenous, social, which is mostly the labor organizations, as well as the forestry companies themselves. And in the new standard, there are enhanced requirements around candidate protected areas. And the FSC certified companies have until this summer to implement most of the standard, but the candidate protected areas work actually has an extended timeline. So just this map here just shows from the previous standards, the candidate protected areas that have been identified, and it totals about 1 million hectares in Ontario. So it's a pretty significant opportunity that we should be looking at in terms of trying to address some of the biodiversity issues we're facing. So we partnered with Birds Canada to look into all of these, like this 1 million hectares of candidate protected areas, because we're really curious to see what sort of conservation values were they actually protecting? What were they actually contributing to biodiversity conservation? And we used the framework that's in the FSC system already, which is called high conservation values, and asking questions such as, do the sites provide habitat for species at risk? Are there species at risk there? Do they have high cultural values? Do they have ecosystems that are declining, and or regionally significant species, and a list of other things. We also assessed whether the sites were near or adjacent to the existing protected areas network, because they're often small and they do better if they're part of the network that exists. And the good news is we did find that the vast majority of the sites, about 85%, were moderate to high in terms of their conservation values. And there was only about 15% that we felt really shouldn't be considered for protection. So as part of the report that we've written, we had a few recommendations, like sort of 3 high-level recommendations for certificate holders. Those are the people who, the forest managers. And they included these things. They need to set a higher obligation to work within their sphere of influence. So this is one of the requirements of FSC, and that is that they need to work with Indigenous peoples and other stakeholders, as well as governments, to help make sure these sites are actually moving along to permanent protection. And as it is right now, there's a lot of these sites on the books that are basically paper parks for all intents and purposes, and they're open to other uses, such as other industrial uses. We are asking the certificate holders to definitely revisit all the low quality sites and some of the moderate quality sites where we have information to provide them about what they're lacking and how they might be able to make some adjustments to make them of higher conservation value. And also to develop stronger and more inclusive engagement processes. So this really varied across the province about how well companies were engaging people who both interested and affected stakeholders, as well as Indigenous communities that overlap with their forest management units. Sorry, so just some of the key take-home messages. Canada and Ontario missed achieving the 2020 international commitment to protect 17% of lands and waters. And although there are new targets, we're still behind, and we need some real momentum to make this happen. About half of Ontario's forests are managed for industrial logging under the FSC system. So we think that's a pretty big chunk of land where there's a good opportunity. A key requirement of the FSC certification is that forest managers work within their sphere of influence, as I mentioned, to move these sites towards permanent protection. And I have talked to a number of forest managers on FSC certified forests, and they can't even put these sites in their forest management plan because of the way the rules are set up. So they're not even able to go that far, let alone convince the province to permanently protect them. And just that this, in total, collectively, they equal 1 million hectares. This could make an enormous contribution to achieving the targets that we're trying to achieve in Ontario. And they're already part of this voluntary certification system. So a lot of the work has already been done. And perhaps most importantly is that we need a provincial government who is going to be a willing partner to help move these towards permanent protection. And as I mentioned, right now they're voluntarily set aside by the forestry companies, and I definitely appreciate that, but they're open to mining, they're open to hydro development, some even residential development. And a lot of these uses are likely incompatible with their high conservation values. So we need some processes put in place by the province to start moving these towards permanent protection.
Okay, thanks, Julie. And I am going to give a quick overview of some of the forest-related campaigns the Wilderness Committee works on. But I am afraid that we are going to get kicked out of our webinar because I only scheduled it till 1:15. I'm not sure what happens after that. So I do want to thank everyone for being here. I'm sorry we didn't really get to questions, but I am going to put up a poll. I mean, there's just so much to talk about and we're only skimming you know, the surface. So I'm going to put up a poll so people can put in what we would most like to see as a topic for future more deep dive webinars. So I'm going to launch that, and at the same time, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the Wilderness Committee campaigns, but I'm going to skip a lot. So I will.
Katie, just so you know, Alex just shared that we're not going to get kicked out at 1:15.
Okay, great. Okay, so for those who can stay on, then that is great. And now I just need to figure out how to share my screen properly. But in general, the Wilderness Committee, overall, we work from the perspective similar to what Julie was just describing with FSC's certification, that a truly sustainable forest industry for this province requires the addition of more protected areas. So I mean, I think no one on this webinar is saying that forestry and logging should end, but it does need to be offset by more protected places, and those protected areas need to be the right ones that have that contribute most to ecosystem services like habitat for endangered species like caribou, old growth, especially in its ability to sequester carbon, is key. And there's many studies that show that for nature-based climate solutions, pro-forestation or keeping intact forests or allowing forests to reach old growth in the short term is actually going to have much more effect than planting millions of trees. Okay, so on that note, okay, let's see if I can get this working. I don't know what's happening. Okay. Sorry, everybody. I seem to have lost my presentation. But so, okay, at the Wilderness Committee, we also do advocate for an end to logging, a phase out of logging in Algonquin Park. And this is sort of for the simple fact that logging is incompatible with the intentions of Ontario's Ontario's Protected Parks and Conservation Areas Act, which is that those places are meant to be managed for the highest level of ecological integrity. Okay, so sorry, I'm really trying to get my presentation back. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, so, and we agree with the Gord Miller, the former environmental commissioner for Ontario, that there is a fundamental distinction between logging sustainably and maintaining the ecological integrity of a protected area. And that's upheld in the Protected Parks Act, in that logging and other industrial activity is banned in protected parks. More recently, the Auditor General, in a report, said that 2/3 of Algonquin Park does not meet the national criteria for protected areas. So that is our overall, and if it was fully protected, it would add 0.5% to the protected areas in Ontario. So Algonquin is undergoing a forest management planning process right now for the next 10 years, which does open up a small window for consultation. We have submitted to that process and had a chance to look at the projected logging for the next 10 years. And so we were sort of scrutinizing it to see, okay, does this actually maintain or prioritize ecological integrity? And I'm just going to show you a couple of maps here. So this first map is, we overlaid the projected logging for the next 10 years onto old growth stands within the park that have been identified from FRI data mostly. So that's aerial data, and some of them have been ground truth, but not all. And that's one of the problems with forestry, is that that FRI data, for the most part, has not been ground truth. But so what this map shows is the red and the blue colors show where projected logging actually overlaps with those old growth areas. And in these areas, we're talking about not so much pine, but mostly hardwood forests that are not really so susceptible to fire disturbance. In our next map, we overlaid, similarly, we overlaid projected road building. So the light pink is planned road building for the next 10 years. Overlaid over the green, which is current roadless areas. So this is just another indicator of relatively intact forests as compared to more logged forests. And so the red areas here, you can see where roads are sort of going into previously unroadless areas. So the red indicates that. So, I mean, what both of these kind of show is that it's a bit concerning, because they illustrate that more and more of the harvest over the next 10 years is having to go into these old growth, less touched, potentially untouched areas. And again, more and more science is showing those old growth, untouched, intact forests as nature-based climate solutions by keeping them intact. So in addition to the need for harvesting more and more field, as well as the impact of logging roads that Dave spoke to, forestry in Algonquin, as we've already mentioned, is also exempt, like all forestry, from the province's Endangered Species Act, a requirement to protect and recover species at risk. So instead, it is held only to sort of the lower bar under the CFSA, which is to minimize and mitigate harm. So protections for species at risk in the logged area of Algonquin are not as high as the protected parks of the park. Okay, and just finally, I'm just going to speak to another. So anyways, here's some of the links where you can use our action tool to voice support for an end to logging or phase out of logging in Algonquin, as well as you can read our full submission to the current forest management process. Okay, and then the next slide, I just want to really quickly mention a more southern forest where we've been working with local residents and ecologists to pursue a path for protection for a forest known as the Cachacoma Forest. It's located in the Kawartha Highlands, and it actually is adjacent, you can see, to Kawartha Highlands Provincial Park, which adds to its value for potential protection because it will create sort of that continuity for habitat. So it is in the management unit for a forest, licensed to a forest company called the Bancroft Minden Forest Company. Last year, a nonprofit research organization called Ancient Forest Exploration and Research did surveys there through a grant and found it to be potentially one of the largest old growth hemlock forests, which is one of the rarest forests in Ontario. So it has potentially very high conservation values in terms of old growth, as well as potential habitat for several species at risk. So, I mean, there's lots I could say about what we've encountered, issues we've encountered in terms of trying to engage with the forest company, with the MNRF, and with the current 10-year planning process to see what avenues are out there to even put this forward as a candidate for a new protected area. And I won't get too much into all of the issues, but the main one I want to highlight is, yeah, we have found that there is significant lack of resources. The MNRF is under-resourced significantly in terms of identifying species at risk habitat in licensed forest areas. But perhaps even more importantly, yeah, what we've encountered is that the province really has no active process or resources in place to pursue the commitments to adding to the network of protected places in the province. And that observation was actually supported in a 2020, November 2020, a report put forward by the Ontario's Auditor General again, where she found that Ontario has been falling behind in adding new protected places, but also that it has no mandate, no staff dedicated to doing that, and no process for doing it. So that's really disturbing from the point of view of adding more protection areas. So yeah, so I think I'll just end it there. And I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm really sorry to all of our participants that we've gone over, but if you want to stay for an extra 5-10 minutes, we'll see if we have any questions that our panelists can answer. And panelists, I'm sorry for keeping you as well, as if you need to log off, that's okay. So I'm going to have a look at our questions. And I know there was a lot about FSC certification that I think Julie did a pretty good job of answering. I know there's a couple questions that about how, about oh, maybe they went away when people answered them. About how NGOs and grassroots sort of settler organizations, environmental organizations can support or work with Indigenous groups and Indigenous communities and nations that are seeking to have a stronger role in forest management. So Robin, I don't know if you want to speak to that one, or anyone else on the panel.
Can you say that question to me again one more time? Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I saw the question and now I can't seem to find it, but there was a couple of questions asking about how ENGOs like the ones on this panel, grassroots communities who are concerned with forest management, can sort of support First Nations in having a stronger role in forest management in the province.
Well, one of the things that, so we too are not necessarily against forestry. It's the intensity of the forest management that is going on. The other thing about even this FSC standard, I've been participating in the FSC standard for quite some time. And to me, it seems like, I'm sorry, window dressing. Oftentimes, they have already talked to the players, i.e. the SFL holders, and they know what my issues are going to be before they even call me. So it's not so independent. And they will also have tried to sort of pacify me, if you will, in terms of some of the current concerns that I may have, because they'll have talked to the SFL general managers and they'll say, well, she's going to come at you about this, and she's going to come at you about that. And, you know, there was a real clear example a few years back on the Nipissing forest where, you know, we were trying to seek some economic opportunities too from the Nipissing forest. We had a forest strategy. And so the general manager thought to offer us the 0.5% of the forest allocation down there. And but so, you know, Martin Litchfield, who was the FSC auditor at the time, called me up and asked me, well, or didn't they offer you that? But seemingly I said, well, yeah, but it's on the table, but it hasn't been negotiated, or it's just something that they know they should do. And then about 2 to 3 weeks later, after the FSC audit was finished, the general manager hadn't had permission from the shareholders to even offer that to Temagami First Nation and or Temagami Anishinaabe. So you see what I mean? There's when they're being contracted to do this work, they're being contracted by the forest companies to certify their wood as FSC certified. So there's sort of no so I'm quite interested in the work that Julie was doing, especially as it relates to the Indigenous Principle 3. And, you know, basically it says free, prior, and informed consent, but it's not happening. And the fact that we're now, you know, into 2 judicial reviews is a demonstration of the fact that the FSC certification process is not good for First Nations. So at the same time, I would say to those NGOs that are putting a lot of weight into the FSC process, that it's not all what it appears to be. And so I think those are some of the ways that we could work together to, you know, make those standards implemented. You know, I think on paper, if you read those standards that are included in those things, it looks good, but they're not being implemented. So, you know, I think if we could all work together to make those standards implemented, I think that would be a good first blush at it. But at the same time, there's sometimes ways in which we depart, First Nations depart from NGOs. And, you know, PJ's example earlier about the land set aside, that's our proposed reserve lands in terms of settlement lands for Temagami First Nation and Temagami Anishinaabe. It was us who sought out getting the forest management plan completed, not the OMNRF. And that was a way of accommodating us. And at the same time, we went from a 2% allocation on that forest to 9%. The other way in which we're moving forward on the Temagami unit is we're also we're also going to be the second local forest management corporation in the province. So there's going to be a Temagami Forest Management Corporation, and through there's, you know, 5 principles. But I'm really hoping, or, you know, I think it's better than the ministry looking after the forest in Temagami. And it was certainly better than them amalgamating the Temagami forest with Nipissing and or Sudbury or Temiskaming, where we're having so much difficulty. So we wanted to keep Temagami as its own unit. And so we led that initiative to look at the tenure model, the governance model that would be held for Temagami. And through that governance model, we will have a seat on that permanent board. It's not, it's not a Winn-Dobbin Stewardship Authority where we're joint managing or co-managing it, but it's a step along the pendulum in the right direction. So I would say it's probably, though, I've heard a lot today about the Algonquin Forest model or the Algonquin Forest. It's probably more akin to that as a corporation. And so, we might still have some issues there where, I won't agree with the Friends of Temagami on the management of the forest for Temagami First Nation and or the land set aside. So we do, and as PJ said, he's not against forestry either, but there are times when we don't always align. And there was a great gal by the name of Alex Thompson. She wrote her PhD or her master's, I can't remember which one, on seeing the forest for the trees, and she studied Temagami First Nation, and she did that sort of NGO example. What are the differences between Indigenous peoples and NGOs? At times we seem to look like we're doing this, but at times we're like this. So thank you.
All right, I'm just going to open it up for a couple minutes to any of the panelists if they want to add anything, either add on to what Robin was just saying or any last words.
I just wanted to say, Robin, I totally agree with you on everything you've said there. And I think it's like behooves the NGO community to make sure that we're paying attention to what the First Nations on those certified units are saying, and when possible, like when desired, have those conversations to make sure that we're supporting Principle 3 around Indigenous rights in particular, as well as all the other principles. And I was just going to mention that I was at one of the General Assemblies a few years back, and another layer of challenge here is that not all of the independent auditors are the same. So one of the things that FSC has put forward in terms of implementing this new standard and moving forward is not FSC, but the actual membership put forward that we want to have more evaluation done of the auditors and making sure that that's really consistent. So that you don't have people in one part of the country or province saying, oh, this FSC is great because we're working with this company, whatever. And then in another part of the province, having those requirements not met and having, just simply because they have a different auditor who set a lower bar or interpreted the standard differently. So it's not great right now. Like, I totally appreciate what you're saying because those things have been happening, but hopefully we can have some continual improvement on making sure that that bar is set high and that all the companies are meeting it, so we can say, yeah, this standard is achieving what it's meant to achieve.
Anyone else want a last word?
Yeah, I would just agree with Julie, and I think Robin's point was so important, and the advocacy that we do, and I know that a lot of groups do, we highlight the importance, the criticality of free, prior, informed consent, and don't say, don't assume that it's all going to be captured in the FSC system, because as Robin said, it's only going to be as important as its implementation. And I think just independently making sure that companies are demonstrating requirement to FPIC is absolutely critical, even if they have FSC certification.
Okay.
I can just say that it's really important for us to work within an ethical space. And so one thing we like to do is to come to these conversations with our ears open and make sure we leave room for other perspectives. And so I think somebody talked about the definition of wilderness and in one of the questions, and it's really important to understand that there are other worldviews and other perspectives, and to come with a way of being open to that instead of just presuming that our Western colonial way is going to dominate. And so how we like to work is that we, for example, when a First Nation declares a protected area under their territory and in their laws, you know, part of the role that we play is we support that, but then also we talk to Ontario and we say, hey, Ontario, how about you reciprocate under Ontario's laws and find a way to work with the First Nations so that the two laws can work together, as opposed to you just saying only white laws or colonial laws work or are in effect. And so we try and have this ethical space and hope that conversation can happen, and hold our government to account, and also help the nations when they ask us to, you know, achieve their outcomes. And so that's how we try and find a way to work our way through that. It's certainly, it takes a while, and you have to be respectful, and you have to be able to have good people to teach you, and it's all really important work. Thank you.
Yeah, I will just add to that one of the other things that came out in the Auditor General's report was that the MNRF, again, has not addressed requests by, I think it was 6 different First Nations in Ontario that had expressed interest in creating what is sort of a new type of Indigenous-led protected area called Indigenous Conservation Protected and Conserved Areas. So yeah, I mean, I think again it goes back to the province and how the province is sort of ignoring the whole idea of new protected areas. But yeah, I think we'll wrap it up. Again, sorry for going over time to everyone who's still with us. I want to really give a huge thanks to all of our presenters for being here, and for the work that you are doing. As I'm sure all of our attendees, our participants are realizing by now, if they didn't know before, this is a really complicated area to work in. It is, you know, difficult when you're talking about conservation in the forestry industry, and there's a lot of work to do. And I hope that this presentation, or these presentations, at least gave our audience sort of some ideas of what are some of the common issues, or what are some of the or maybe not so common issues that conservation organizations, First Nations groups, consultation, around consultation in forestry industry as well. And we will be following up with everyone. We will be sending a recording of this webinar. We will be sending you a bunch of links to some of the resources that our presenters brought up in this webinar, and we will also be informing you of future webinars as well. So I'll say thank you to everyone, and miigwech, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And thank you to all of us for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.